That was Tanya Sillam reporting. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Karl Deeter from the Irish Mortgage Brokers and Senator Aideen Hayden, who is chairperson of the advocacy group for those who are renting, Threshold. You're both very welcome. Aideen, I'm going to start with you because we saw Gwen Connell's story there. What's your thoughts around how to prevent that happening to other families?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say, Claire, that I wish that situation were unusual. Unfortunately, it isn't, and that the number of people now coming to our services presenting as homeless or at risk or severe risk of homelessness has more than doubled over the last 12 months.
Because landlords are saying to them, your rent last week was X and now it is X plus a certain amount.
Quite literally, we're seeing people coming to our doors every day telling us that they've been asked for rent increases of 20% or even more. And the reality of the matter is families now are presenting as homeless. That's unusual. That wasn't normally the situation in other times because they simply just cannot afford the money they're being asked in rent, and neither can they access alternative accommodation. We recently did a survey and we found that only 1.2% of landlords would actually accept rent supplement, which is the government's support for people on low incomes.
But if you're a landlord, and we all know that that traditional image of the landlord isn't probably who the landlord is right now, it's somebody who maybe got caught with a property during the Celtic Tiger. Now, they're also facing increased mortgage repayments, and the market is dictating that they can charge more for rent. And if the family who are there can't pay it, there's a big queue of people who will, Aideen. It's a market reality.
Agree with you, Claire. Yes, I mean, first of all, I think you have to accept there's more than one rental market. And, you know, you're right, there are a lot of landlords out there who've had a difficult time during the recession. But we're seeing many people coming into our services who are renting properties that are long bought and paid for, where there's no mortgage remaining on these properties, where you simply have, dare I say, it's not a word I like to use, but profiteering on the back of a shortage of supply of housing, and that is why we're advocating a level of rent control. Okay,
well, let's see what Karl Deeter has to say about profiteering, shark landlords profiting off these people who are in dire straits. Some of them we saw Gwen Connell in the report.
Yeah, I guess it falls back on the old reliables of the blame game. To be honest with you, if someone has no mortgage on a property, that's what progressive income taxation is for, and you go onto the higher band at one of the lowest levels in all the OECD. But I think that the issue here is that rent increases have brought this crusade back in vogue, but really rent increases are like a rising temperature almost. And that's like having a fever and then blaming the thermometer because you have a fever. The actual illness is a housing shortage, and that's the key problem here. And really, when you boil it down, an absence of a housing policy, an absence of any action in a market that is currently fairly dysfunctional,
Karl,
it's actually more of an issue for politicians and government and Labour in particular.
The housing stock shortage, but how can it be fair for a landlord to come along to a family and say, you know what, I'm going to increase your rent by 20% plus next week because I feel like it, because I know I can get it from the next people if you won't pay it to me?
I suppose that you've got to look at it in context, okay? Because for a start, rents had been falling for years. As a matter of fact, this idea of rent control was first raised by Threshold in its modern sense on the report in the Commission of Private Rental Accommodation in the year 2000. Now, if we had done it over the last 10 years, here's what you would have got, and this is the thing about ideology versus empirical numbers, is that state rents are up 80% over the last 10 years. So if you want to look at the most evil landlords, it's actually the state, not the private landlords. Second is that the private rents are really only back to where they were 10 years ago. And if we had connected the rents to the consumer price index, they'd be 20% higher than they are now. And I don't see anyone calling for a 20% increase on rents. Now, because people got a 20% increase on rents, that's nothing to do with this proposal. That's actually a repricing in the market, and it's tragic, and we should probably have social housing for people in that position, but what's happening is that landlords are being forced into that, and then they're being seen as the bad guys for a job that the state isn't doing.
Let's talk about that, Aideen. Karl saying that it's a simplistic answer to a complex problem, which is all about the shortage of availability of housing, and that's a government problem, that's a policy problem.
You're right, it is a very complex problem, and there's no doubt about it. Rent control, and I would call it actually rent certainty, Karl, is only part of the problem. I mean, you've made a couple of points there, Karl, which I'd have to dispute. I mean, first of all, this old chestnut about rents having fallen in 2008, and if, you know, we had rent control, tenants would actually be paying 20 or 30% more is just simply not true. And secondly,
rents didn't fall, is that what you're saying?
Rents didn't fall across the board. They particularly didn't fall at the lower end of the market. And secondly, it is a case of of an issue of supply and demand, and nobody is denying that. But these rises and falls, even if you accept that they happen, are not in anybody's interest. They're not in the landlord's interest, and they're not in the tenant's interest. I mean, we're dealing day in and day out with families who've got children in school who need to know that their children are going to be in the same school in 6 months' time, that they're going to be playing for the same GAA club. Now, we're not talking about going back to 1980s style. In fact, it's not 1980s, it's more like 1920s style rent control that was ruled out of order, and justly so. It was ruled out of order because it was completely disproportionate. I mean, you had sitting tenants living in properties for 50 years paying peppercorn rents. Now, nobody's advocating that. What we're saying is, under the existing legislation, the Residential Tenancies Act, tenants have a right to remain for up to 4 years. And it is logical to say that if they have a right to remain for up to 4 years, there should be a level of rent certainty. This is not unusual.
Isn't there a problem, though, and Karl, you might know the answer to this. Irish people don't want to sign long leases. Is that a case in point?
It doesn't tend to be popular. I mean, there are some schemes out there that operate on long leases, and people are free to contract as they feel fit. The issue with long leases is actually in the Tenancy Act is that tenant rights in Ireland are still not as strong as they perhaps could be. But Aideen is making some great points there, which I fundamentally agree with, which is the lower end of the market is being attacked. Lower end of the market is particularly at risk due to policy, which is getting rid of all sorts of important housing for certain groups of people, like bedsits, which some of them are awful, but not all of them are. And reducing...
They were eliminated last year, wasn't it?
Well, the statutory instrument 534, I think, came in, and it was a standards of rental accommodation. And if two adults wanted to share a bathroom, they can't. They have to have their own. And that type of reinvestment requirement meant that a lot of people aren't doing bedsits anymore. They're a key housing for middle-aged single people and also for low-paid immigrants. But the other thing is that there's a total inertia in government, and they're not providing the low-end housing because typically that is where government were most active, so they could provide a differential rent for the person, which was relative to their means.
Tell me what's wrong with rent control as far as you're concerned.
It's discriminatory for a start, and I don't support discrimination. It rewards existing renters and punishes new entrants. It hurts labour mobility. It's inefficient. It is also contrary to equality between all people. There's also the issue of it reducing supply, because when you set a price control on something, price controls on anything tend to limit supply. If you look at states or cities in America that have rent control, like New York and San Francisco, it's the same places that have the highest rents in the entire country. And the popular comparisons don't hold. People say, oh, look at the Germans. But if you want to rent a house in Bremen, you've got to put the kitchen in. Kitchen is about 5 to 10% of a property cost.
But
if
Karl,
renters wanted to do that, we'd probably be in favour of it.
I mean,
Aideen, yes.
Yes, I always find it amazing that people mention the New York example. It's the usual one about the little old lady renting the penthouse,
use San
paying
Francisco
$50
instead.
and this struggling couple underneath paying $50,000. That type of rent control would be unconstitutional in Ireland, so it's disingenuous. Secondly, in relation to supply, as it happens in Holland, they introduced, in fact, sorry, it was Denmark, they introduced regulations to deregulate the market because there was a shortage of supply, thinking that if they deregulate it, they get more supply. And you know what they're doing now? They're reintroducing regulation, and it didn't work. Last week in France, they introduced rent control in 28 French cities. Why? Because ordinary people couldn't afford to rent in French cities. I think, Karl, the fact of the matter is most European countries have a level of rent control way exceeding what we have in this country. And I regard myself as a European. I don't regard New York as being a particularly good example for the Irish market.
Karl, quick
you can pretty much take any jurisdiction you want, and you'll find that it's not a like-for-like comparison. And really all this is populism, and it has great energy in terms of making a robust argument against a pretty popular bad guy. But in terms of fixing the issue, which is supply, that's a government problem. The government is doing nothing, so I don't see why landlords are being blamed.
Karl Deeter and Senator Aideen Hayden, thank you both very much. David.